What happens when someone is told a lie from childhood onward, something that just transforms the way they see everything, and not just about themselves, but a lie about their whole people and a lie about their entire racial identity? What happens when this lie turns into abusive, oppressive, or traumatic and violent acts? How does that affect people? That's what we're going to be talking about today with Sheila Wise Rowe. She is going to help us understand, identify, and hopefully kind of move through racial trauma. As always, this is the Embodied Faith podcast, and I'm Jeff Holzglaw. We're seeking to integrate kind of the best of neuroscience and psychology and spiritual formation and our walk of faith. And we're brought to you by Grassroots Christianity, which seeks to grow everyday faith. So Sheila has over 25 years of experience as a Christian counselor, spiritual director, educator, writer, and speaker. And she is active in local healing and reconciliation ministries. And she's written a book called Healing Racial Trauma, The Road to Resilience. And she just released another book called Young, Gifted, and Black, A Journey of Lament and Celebration. Sheila, welcome to the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you could jump on with us and take a little time out of your morning. So could you just start off by telling us a little bit about yourself? How did you get into the kind of this calling to be either a counselor, a spiritual director, or this kind of healing and reconciliation minister? What was, I know you covered that a little bit in your books, but what is kind of that journey for you in a real practical sense?
Yeah, I actually went into college wanting to go to medical school, and it was in college that I really had a sense of I was doing internships and really discovered that what I wanted to do really was about healing, but it was more emotional healing, and so that started me on a journey of working in different settings, secular settings and Christian settings, and working with a wide population, kids, adults, couples, families. So I, for many years, was a licensed marriage and family therapist and also a counselor, and started a Christian counseling program out of my church. And so a lot of what I did back in the day, there really wasn't programs. And so it really was learning as I went, gaining insights through some of what was available in Christian circles, but also secular psychology, and really, praying, wrestling with how to integrate the two of those things.
That's great. And then you started like reconciliation ministries. Was that reconciliation between families, or was that more of kind of the racial reconciliation or kind of socioeconomic reconciliation more broadly?
You know what? A lot of it was working individually with individuals and couples. And what I saw was that for a lot of people of color, not just black folk, but others, that there were issues that were coming up around race and identity that were a part of their struggle. It wasn't just emotional struggles, but it was how racism had affected them emotionally as well. And so that came into the work that I did with people.
So you saw a common theme. That's not just kind of your
Yeah,
marriage or something. It's kind of these other larger
absolutely.
factors. And then over the last, 10, 20 years, there's been this like larger conversation about trauma and then
Yes.
racial trauma. So could you, and I know that's what you do a lot of right now. So could you define trauma? How do you think of trauma? And then we'll kind of talk about racial trauma.
Yeah, trauma in general, if we all experience trauma, it doesn't matter who we are to a certain degree. And there's often conversations about big T trauma and little T trauma, and like big T traumas being these really catastrophic traumatic events, like a major car accident, a death, that kind of thing. And then smaller traumas that are troubling yet not life threatening. And how, when I think about how do we navigate that, there's commonalities when we don't. You often see symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and that a lot of that came from those who served in the military coming back from war, and But what we're seeing is that with just the more generalized kind of trauma, we're seeing some of those symptoms. And specifically with racial trauma, uh, what we were seeing was that it wasn't even just the PTSD kinds of symptoms, but because of these big things, there were these little things that were happening also on a daily basis almost. And how research has really shown that those little t traumas like accumulate over time, and that just the number of little t traumas can have as big an impact as a big one. And so um, there have been lots of conversations around whether it's why is someone upset about microaggressions? What's the big deal about them?
Mm-hmm.
And yet, this lack of awareness that, when someone is pulled over, that was not the first time they were pulled over by
Mm-hmm.
law enforcement. In many cases, and in many of the high profile um, deaths that we've seen, the people were pulled over hundreds of times. And
Mm-hmm.
so that does something to a person in terms of how they navigate through life, what are their views about law enforcement, and it does something to the body as well as the mind.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes, like for trauma, we often think of like a catastrophic event, or you're sent off to war, which is one context, and there's horrible things happen, and you come back home, and there's a different context, and then you don't know
Yeah,
how to kind of function. Um, but what you're saying, and I think a lot of trauma research is now becoming more aware of, is well, it's not just like that car accident,
yeah,
or the shooting, or like that one shooting or something, but it's a lot of chronic kind of traumatic
yeah,
events
yeah.
that kind of compound and build and things like that. Um, so what are some of those kind of experiences, or what are those compounding kind of, you said little t traumatic events that really um, kind of affect things in like in a racist kind of way?
Yeah, yeah.
What are the markers of those things or the symptoms?
Yeah, I think that you have to take racial trauma is coming from a place, and it's coming from experiences, and some of those experiences are historical. And so in our families of origin, if we look back, we can trace where family members have experienced, whether it was during Jim Crow, the enslavement of our ancestors, all of those, you think, well, that happened a long time ago. But what happens is that we we know those stories. We hear those stories in our families. Um, we uh, we know them because there's studies like epigenetics, which looks at how it may even affect the DNA without changing the structure of it, but there's a weakening of that. And so it's not just interpersonal. So we're familiar with that. We're familiar with one person being racist with another, but it's more than that. It's systemic, and whether people want to believe that or not, the research, the data, everything is there. It is systemic. And it wasn't just that. I've had one person say, well, since the 1960s, everything has been fine. That's not true. And so we're looking at how, there are ways in which, whether it's educationally, whether it's in medicine, where people live, how they live, what are the services they receive, systemic racism is alive and well. We see it in public space, and like who's allowed, whether it's overtly allowed or passively kind of allowed to be in certain spaces or not. We're seeing it with how some of the monuments that came down in 2020, particularly. And there was a reason for that, because those monuments were basically communicating a message about who is in charge, who is in control, and whether it's in the South and it was the Confederacy, and you're seeing monuments everywhere. It's like it's an honoring of a time and an era and a people way back then who basically subjugated an entire population. So those kind of meta communications are a part of it. Environmentally, like where is the dump at?
Yeah.
Where is the water issues, whether it's Flint or Michigan or wherever, and then issues around white privilege, where um, you're like, well, how would I have white privilege? Well, it really is one of, if, and I always say to people that uh, there's a way in which there are just assumptions. There are assumptions that this movie or this book or whatever, that it is white, and then everybody else, people of color, we've got to locate ourselves in that story. It's it Because that is the center.
Mm.
Um, we don't get our stories told, and we're seeing more of the stories being told, and that is great. It's wonderful, because more than than the people of color, we're seeing more and more white people who are like, wow, I'm getting something from this as well. I'm learning something about a different culture, but it's also speaking to me and my situation. And so that brings us all together in terms of, we all have a story to share, and we can learn from one another without one having to kind of figure out and locate themselves. So those are just a few in terms of racism and the racial trauma of that. As I said, it trickles down historically, personally. We also have vicarious trauma.
Okay, good. I was just about to ask
Yeah,
about that. What, because that really stuck out to me. What is, because a lot of times, like you said, we think of racism as maybe like a personal affront that
yeah,
happens to an individual person, physically assaulted. But you're kind of bringing up these. Well, there's literature, there's statues, there's access or denial to space. So what does vicarious racism mean?
yeah. So it's, vicarious trauma and vicarious racism as well. And I think that people don't understand that. I'm going to speak as a Black woman. For me to watch some of what I saw in 2020, 2021, and also throughout my life, it may not directly be about me, but I feel it. I
Mhm,
experience that because I think this could be my husband or brother or my son.
mhm,
This could be my daughter. And so I am feeling that viscerally. Vicarious trauma can, it's not necessarily that it happened to me again. But for instance, when Michael Brown was killed and he laid in the street for 4 hours, they said that over 200 households had direct view of this Black guy, laying in the street, dead, and no one attending to it, just like he was roadkill. And how horrific that was for them, not just for his parents, but for those who are watching that. That could be me, that could
mhm,
be my child.
mhm.
And so every time that there's an incident that happens, um, many of us are experiencing that trauma, and not knowing what do we do with that.
Mm, mm. So it's that experience of, well, that could have been me, or that could have been my son, that could have been my husband, that just, and then your whole body, as we're learning, your mind and your bodies then moves through different reactions.
Yes, yes,
And then that creates chronic stress and chronic trauma and other things that we all know leads to increased possibility of disease and sickness, because
absolutely.
your physical resources are not being used to kind of monitor the wellness of your body and your emotional state. It's actually being kind of
Yeah,
pulled out of you and sucked out of you because of these kind of vicarious emotional responses that either could have happened to you, or has happened to you, and then you're kind of remembering, and it causes all these kind of long-term problems. And you go through in your book, Healing Racial Trauma, you go through kind of some of these experiences. And the first one you talk about is just fatigue. Like there's a,
yeah.
like a, and this kind of goes back to the connection between mind and brain and relationships. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of fatigue response? What are the different aspects of that?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that happens physically is that there's a what they call weathering. And so there's a way in which over time it just wears us down on multiple levels. And so we end up seeing premature aging, we see diseases as you referenced. But there's a weariness that is physical, and there's a weariness that's emotional. And that um, we can get exhausted and are exhausted at the struggle. And it feels in many ways like two steps forward, one step back. In some ways, in 2020, with the protest and the arrests, and it felt like, wow, we're moving forward. And then we saw in 2020 later and going into this year the backlash.
Mhm.
And so, under the cover of CRT, it was like, no, we can't talk about anything. We don't want to talk about the past. We don't want to. And it's exhausting to, as a person of color, to feel that there looks like there's movement, and then we're back to where we were
Mm,
before. And that level of exhaustion really affects, like, how do we navigate through life? How do we navigate in predominantly white spaces and in churches as well? Is this a place where I really feel welcomed, where I feel supported? And so we question that, and we're absolutely exhausted,
mm,
which affects how do we raise our children. It affects our marriages, our communities, and it kind of bleeds everywhere.
mm.
And so, yeah, it's something that if we're not paying attention, we might not see that that's what that is. That given you throw the pandemic on top of that,
Right.
and you see how disproportionately it's affected communities of color. It's just another level of assault, and it's exhausting.
So how you speak a little bit in your book about how God has ministered to you in the midst of that exhaustion, or
Yeah.
some of the practices that you've adopted or kind of helped others to kind of work through that exhaustion. Could you just kind of speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, one of the very first thing is really acknowledging that that is an issue. And
Mm,
I think that we are so used to just grinding, we're going to just pushing through in whatever way that we can. And so to be able to stop and to recognize that, I've had more than one person who's read the book and they were like, wow, this explains what's been going on for me. And so it's shedding light on what has happened and taking that time to just listen. And it's listening, and it can be with a therapist, it can be with a pastor, or even a friend. But being able to share your whole story is really the first step in moving forward in that. There are some
mm,
really practical things that we can do. One is again working with someone, and even on your own. I recommend people do a genogram and we're looking at their family of origin and, like, what are the things that may have passed down generationally, and it doesn't, not just the negative stuff but the positive stuff as well.
mm,
But so having that broader picture of what has occurred, and then the other piece is really about having a self-care plan. It's a plan for how are you going to get healthy, stay healthy, and counseling is a part of it. But then how is you're getting releasing that stress from your body, because part of racial trauma is that we hold it in, and that's when that weathering occurs, and that's where the damage happens. And so there are real practical things, whether it's movement, it's dance. How are we breathing? We
mm,
tend to hold our breath and kind of, grit our teeth, and yet, let it releasing that and really inviting the Lord to meet us in that place where we're experiencing that tension and that pain. And so I'm a big proponent of listening prayer, and just whether it's alone or with others, and really not just having a one-way conversation,
mhm,
but a two-way conversation with God, about what it is that you're experiencing, how lament factors in. And King David, he was an expert at that, of really being brutally honest with God about not just what was happening to him, but also questioning God. Like, God is
mm.
big enough to handle our questions. And so, as we're, in this place of being really weary, of just asking, how long, Lord? I mean, David says that multiple times in the Psalms. And so, um, being being able to do that, of being intentional about uh, what what do I want, for my life and for my children and for the next generation, and how do I contribute towards that, even though it may feel like one step forward, two steps back. How do I continue to go forward, and the Lord strengthening us to continue to keep moving. So there's just a few. There's many more.
No, that's great. So I heard, community,
Yeah,
find a
yeah,
sustainable plan. Don't neglect self-care.
yeah,
And then the spiritual practices of centering prayer, healing prayer, and things like that,
yep,
as a way of admitting to, and then kind of sustaining through the fatigue. You
Yeah.
mentioned, the wear and tear, the weathering of holding things in, and that was your kind of
Mhm.
your second point, which really struck out to me, which is the idea of silence and how silence becomes, for those who have been traumatized, it's a way of coping with silence or of coping with trauma in one sense, but then it's also a way of passing down that pain to the next generation. And
Mm.
so the you kind of mentioned, I wrote in the side of one of the pages that one generation's silence becomes deafening to the next generation.
Absolutely.
And so could you just kind of talk about the trauma and the silence and how that kind of all works together?
Yeah. Oftentimes when trauma happens, we can we don't have the we don't have the tools to actually deal with it, and particularly if it happened really early on. And so I want to just say that as a child, if we've experienced trauma, and I write about some of this in the book about my experience, traumatic experience being bused in Boston, and in the silence chapter, I talk about Nori, whose father was he's Japanese, and the family was interned, and during World War II, and so one of the things about silence is that we often don't. So Nori's father didn't have the words, didn't know how to deal with what he was experiencing, losing so much, losing his home, losing his community, being put on a train and sent to the middle of the U.S. And placed in an internment camp. And so he shut down his voice. And in a similar way, I did that as well. And many of us do. And that is because as children, that's all we know how to do. And that's okay. We're trying to survive. But the reality is, as we get older and we now have more tools and more resources, the challenge is to begin to open up and to speak about what happened then as well as what is happening now. Because when we don't, we end up seeing what I share about my own life and with Nori's life, and how that silence affected his father physically, emotionally, leading to substances and an abusive way in which he dealt with his wife and children. And that's one of the consequences of not speaking out, is that uh, it's going to come out. The trauma is going to speak in one way or another,
Mm,
and
mhm.
it will come out. Um, so we have to be mindful of that. Two things I wanted to say, that even now with the children, that we've got to be intentional about giving them space to speak up about how they're feeling. And so there and are we shutting them down in any way? But the other is, as an adult, where are you still silent? Where are you still holding on to something? And it may feel like, okay, you're in denial. And sometimes denial, you can't force somebody out of denial. Um, you got to wait it out, and when you're ready, and I want to just say that the Lord is with you in that process of
Mm,
getting you ready to deal with the trauma, the denial, and then so then you can then regain your voice.
mm, mm. Yeah, thank you for that. I felt for me when I was reading that would be a helpful way to kind of cultivate compassion for other people,
Absolutely.
maybe for your own parents or for a partner who has trouble speaking about those things, because it's painful for you to know there's something wrong and you don't know how to help them. But there is a sense in which there's compassion. Well, they don't have the words, they don't know, and you can kind of help them, to do the work a little bit. But I also think what you just said, the trauma will speak no matter what. That's
Yeah.
just what is being spoken, and then what are the effects of those words? Is it going to cause healing eventually, or is there going to be more harm that gets passed on? And so, I think that's a really important encouragement to have compassion for others, but then to also do that work as best as you can. That's
Yeah.
it's a
You know
start.
what? I also want to just say that sometimes the the trauma responses are, I've got to get bigger, I've got to get louder, I've got to be in control. And so
Mhm.
for some white folk whose ancestors immigrated from really horrific situations, who came here, that's what it was. It was about, I got to get bigger, I got to get stronger, I've got to not be in that place of weakness anymore. And so
Mm,
it becomes really scary to say, you know what, we're going to honestly look at the past. We're going to look at what damage that was done by your ancestors,
Mhm.
and how do we stop perpetuating that now? When I think that for some people, it's a fear of vulnerability. It's a fear, and even if it's not a conscious one, of I'm going to be back in that place where I'm going to be vulnerable like I was back in the old country or my great grandfather was. And
Mhm.
so I can't do that and I'm not going to go there. And so I don't want to deal with history.
Mm. Yeah. Well, this is a maybe off topic a little bit, but if like we just had, and I understand culture is not monolithic, right? So people
Yes.
find different ways, right? But if you say, well, the white American culture, frontier culture, coming out of Europe, trying to escape a bad situation or find something else, it put on all the postures of dominance, of certainty, of being big, like you said, um, and things like that. Then it's and then we could say, well, that was actually a trauma response to what they left. They had to be big to survive, and that had all sorts of negative effects for people of color all throughout the continent and all the people we brought here to do the work. Um, and so to kind of deal with that trauma is actually to become smaller and to become more vulnerable. And that's its own kind of pain and uncertainty that's involved with that. But then for people, people of color, formerly enslaved, like they were made to be small. They were made to thought to be inconsequential. And so they're actually, traumatized that way. And their trauma therapy or response is to actually grow bigger. Right. So we have these two cultures, that are going different directions. And it's no wonder that we're not doing it very well. And that it takes a lot of work because,
You know what though?
um,
I
yeah,
think
I don't,
that
did I mischaracterize that?
no, no, no,
That was
no,
just a brainstorm off the top of my head. So please
no,
correct
no.
me.
You're absolutely correct. I think the issue then is that as believers, where are we going? We are really going to the center, which is Christ. That's where we should be going.
Yeah.
So,
Right. Right.
that's where we should be going. And the problem is that I frankly feel that the church has decided to do something totally different.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No.
yeah,
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, that maybe that could be a whole nother episode that we could talk about. Um, but we can agree on the goal is to follow Jesus through this. So
absolutely,
this
absolutely.
is so this next topic is one where people I think disagree. What does it mean to follow Jesus? As you speak about rage and how rage is the result of persistent abuse and oppression, that those who don't have a voice or those whose voices are not being listened to, the anger, which could maybe be a productive kind of emotion, becomes rage, which maybe isn't. And so some people, feel like, yeah, we need to harness the rage in the face of the injustice of racism as a good thing, as a way to kind of move forward. And then others, usually, my people, the white people, the leaders say, well, rage is like a sin and we need to focus on forgiveness. And, you know, and both say, well, both of those things are following Jesus. And so we're kind of confused on what that is. So could you speak? You did a really great job speaking about that in the book, but could you just kind of talk a little bit about that, like the uses or abuses of rage and
Yeah.
how that fits with your journey?
Well, you know what? I have to say that God meets us where we're at. And so,
Amen.
for some folk, the huge travesties of justice are just horrific, and there's a justifiable anger about
Mm.
that, and and I certainly have been in that place um, throughout my life, and the question is, what do you do with that anger? Um, it is something that if we actually, that I use the lament psalms as part of that of David. Like David said some things. He's like, smite them all, kill them, you know, um,
Right.
kill their children. I mean, it's just like, whoa, wow. Like, why did God say that this guy was like the apple of his eye? Really? And it's because he honestly came to God exactly where he was in
Hmm.
his rage at times, and he didn't. Although there were moments where he did. So in the case of Bathsheba, where he clearly sinned.
Hmm.
Um, but the one
Yes.
thing about him is that he did go to the Lord, even if he was convicted um, uh, by the priest, even though he tried to hide it initially. He eventually took that sin, he and the Psalms, taking his anger, taking his disappointment at God, all of it to the Lord, and saying, Lord, this I'm giving this to you. What do you want me to do? And I think that's the question that we have to ask the Lord. What would you have me do? Not me think this is how I want to do it, because obviously, we're human and we think we know, and so we're just going to do what we want to do. But Lord, how do you want me to express that? What does it look like? Do I
Mm.
need to go out and protest today? Is it about my voting? Is it about my just caring for my neighbor? Is it serving in a community that's different from me? What is that? How do I harness that anger, as you mentioned? And I can only do my piece. Um, there's this analogy about the whole thing about eating. How do you eat an elephant? And racism being this elephant in the room. It's that everybody has to take a little piece. No one
Mm.
person can eat an entire elephant.
Right.
So if we all have our piece, then we can start to dismantle it. And we have to have that perspective that what piece that I can contribute uh, as the Lord has led me, like that's my piece to contribute. And and my anger, giving that to him, and him saying, this is how I want you to deal with that. The problem with rage is that it can become toxic. It
Mm.
can stay in our bodies. It can, and the damage that I talked about before, it explodes.
Mm.
And so we've got to attend to that anger. It's not gonna be pretty. And I'm saying this from experience, personally, and as a clinician for close to 30 years. I've never seen anybody holding on to rage and anger. And I understand people come in with that, and I am patient and walking with people through that.
Mm.
But you can't think that you can hold on to that forever and it's going to do anything good. It's not going to do anything good. It isn't.
Mm.
Not in your body.
Yeah.
And if you can harness it and have impact uh, out there in the world to make positive change, yes, um, as well as dealing with it in your own self.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, and I think speaking of emotions, um, like anger at its best has a sense, a twofold sense, which is um, ideally our relationship would be better than it is, but it's not. There's something wrong. There's something broken. There's injustice in our relationship. And now anger gives me the energy, or gives us the energy, to come up with new solutions and to overcome the obstacle to bring the relationship forward again. That's at its best what anger would be doing. And so we shouldn't be angry with ourselves for being angry, as long as we're feeling the motion to find solutions and to overcome the obstacles.
Yeah.
And
One
so,
one thing that I did share in the book was about the work of Dr. Bacharova, and she talks about this whole cycle of revenge.
mm,
That, and if we use our anger in that way, like my anger, I'm going to use this anger to get revenge.
mm,
It what it does is it actually gives the perpetrator excuses to say, oh yeah, this is why, and then the perpetrator continues to heap on abuse. And so at a certain point, we have, as believers, have to say, okay, Lord, we crying out to the Lord, we need intervention here.
mm,
And there's a way in which I need to release people, and I, believe me, have to do that regularly, um, into the Lord's care. But also, Lord, what do you want me to do in terms of how to relate to them? How do I bring justice? This is not about forgiveness is just like cheap grace, and oh, I'll forgive you and you can continue on with your bad behavior. It's like,
right,
no,
right.
and what you did was not okay. um, but I want to walk in a way that really um, is being led by the Holy Spirit in
Mm,
terms of how do I deal with the what I see.
yeah, that's great. Well, you were being led by the Holy Spirit to write another book
Yeah.
to kind of the younger generation that you call, and the book is called Young, Black, and Gifted, A Journey of lament and celebration. And you kind of just before we jumped on, pressed record, you said that this is kind of extending the work of your previous book. Could you kind of just talk a little bit about how these two books fit together and what your hope was for the second one?
Yeah. So the title actually is Young, Gifted, and Black, A Journey of
Oh, did I
Lament
say it
and
wrong?
Celebration.
Oh, I did. Sorry, I wrote it down wrong. Young, gifted, and black. There we go.
Yes, Young, Gifted, and Black, A Journey of Lament and Celebration. And so um, one thing that I was seeing and that was coming out of the book, Healing Racial Trauma, really focused on Black, Indigenous, other people of color. And what I was seeing with young Black millennials and younger adults was that there was a certain demographic that within that who were high achievers, and it wasn't just academically; it was in sports. It was they were really pushing forward, and there are ways in which they were at risk, but in not the traditional sense, but at risk in that they were often celebrated, and yet no one was really seeing the cost that it took for them to get to where they are. No one was seeing their private pain. As I mentioned to you earlier, we started to see this with Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, and just these really high, like these high striving women who, in the middle of everything, just said, "I can't do this anymore. I've got to
Mm,
attend to my mental health." Um, and in some ways, they really modeled that the need to really hold both of your life, like the ways in which you're celebrated, but also the ways in which you're dealing with lament. You're dealing with you need to deal with it. You need to deal with past trauma as well. And in life, where it's about moving through life holding both of those things. And, um, and so I've had a lot of responses, interestingly, from people who were younger than who I thought would be the target, and even older, as well as
mm,
millennials, who were like, "Wow, like this is me right now," or "That was me when I was young," because I share different stories in every chapter of different people and their experiences, and
mm,
people have located themselves at various points in their lives, or they're raising children and they're like, wow, this is really giving me a heads up in terms of my own child and what I need to be aware of. And each chapter takes you through how this person dealt with a lot of issues, racism being another part of that.
mm,
So if you overlay everything with the racism that these folk are experiencing. And so people are often shocked when someone, whether it's an Oprah Winfrey or something, she, gets denied access into a shop, and you think, really? But yeah, and in so many ways that um, they're having to deal with the issues that I talk about in healing racial trauma, but from this other place. They're
mm.
getting into the best colleges, they've got jobs, they're, you know, in on sports team, or they have aspirations for that, and yet they're having to deal with their past stuff from their families and also racism.
Mm.
And so the book is really about that. It's about letting them know that they're seen, they're valued, they're loved, even beyond what it is that they do or say, and that they are loved and they don't have to be perfect. And this is a time to take stock, but also to hold like their whole story, not just a part of their story.
Mm. That's great. Well, it sounded like, um, just thinking through kind of your other book, that you're hoping to honor and to celebrate, the next generation, but then also make sure that they don't fall into the trap of the fatigue or the silence, where where
Absolutely.
you're being, you're accomplishing so much, but maybe you're going to burn out with the fatigue, and
Absolutely.
there's this silencing of a certain part of them that you're wanting to fend off. And that just sounds great. That's a message, for all of us coming out of trauma, or raising the next generation, because it seems like, you know, we have kids, and it seems like the kids kind of learn the wrong lesson from the adults
Yeah.
sometimes. They learn how to be the opposite of them, and that's how
Yeah.
I parented the opposite way that I was parented, and
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
types of things. So, well, thank you so much for taking a
Thank
little
you.
time to come on. And again, let me say it the proper way. So it's young, Gifted and Black, A Journey of Lament and Celebration, just published by InterVarsity Press.
Yes.
And the book earlier that we were talking about was called Healing Racial Trauma. This is Sheila Wise Rowe. Thank
Yes.
you so much for being
Thank
on with
you.
us today.
Thank you for having me. Thanks.
Absolutely.